welcome everyone to today's Brigstow Presents. Some of you, I think, maybe were with us. I'm just noticing a few familiar names on the right of my screen. So I know some of you joined us for the last one of these, where we thought a little bit about senses and the environment. Today, we're thinking much more around unearthing hidden histories. And we've got a couple of the project teams that have been working on CCORN projects with us, which is fantastic. What we're going to do is we're going to start with Jenny Post as a woman and then move on to becoming Elizabeth Blackwell. We are recording this, so if you'd prefer not to appear on screen, maybe just pop your camera off and then you'll avoid appearing at any moment in kind of physical form, in visual form. One of the things that'd be great is if people bung questions as they get them into chat, and we'll make sure we cover those, and we can either respond to them in chat or we can ask the teams to respond to those. What we'll do is have a very brief moment for questions just straight after the first team is presented and then after the second team, but then we'll have a bit more time at the end for Q&A. Because it's a Zoom room, feel free to ask the question yourself if you're happy to appear and to voice it yourself, or otherwise just, please do use the chat and I can just ask the question on your behalf. So do whatever's most comfortable to you. Down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see something which says live transcript, CC live transcript. So if you click on that, then you'll be able to see the text of what is being spoken. So that's useful, hopefully. Sometimes it's a little bit dodgy, but hopefully it gives you a sense of what people are saying. So what we'd love to do is welcome Tom and team first of all. And the project that Tom's been working on is called Jenny Posed as a Woman. And I guess, Tom, what would be nice maybe is for you, first of all, to introduce us to Jenny. So it would be lovely if you could introduce us to Jenny. And tell us a little bit about the research project and what the question you asked was together.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So Jenny Moore was a person that I came across when I was touring another show that was pertaining to LGBTQ plus histories in the form of a male story about gross indecency. And I was touring that show around the country and I came across Jenny's story in the Newcastle upon Tyne archive. And all that was really there was just a mugshot of this person and a couple of newspaper articles. But I knew that I wanted to make a show about Jenny and their life. Shall I just get going?
Please do, Tom, please do.
So I wanted to start with like a little bit of an incantation, if you will. A ghost stuck in unobtainable records. A swish of a long skirt. Her fragrance surrounds me. Stuck on a hard drive or bound up in volumes of names crying to be let out. A mugshot that's with a stare that pierces through me. Defiant with perfectly coiffed hair. A life of poverty but with money stashed away. Hard cash under the floorboards or hidden in her undergarments. Moving away to survive or hide. Masquerading and posing or telling the truth. So the first question that we were given was around the questions that we started to, I'm going to put the light back on now, was the questions that we started to ask. And these are just, I just looked at the application form basically this morning and looked at them. And it was quite interesting really to see how we navigated those questions. So these are the questions that we were exploring. How did living outside of the law shape the meaning or experience of a living outside of a conventional gender presentation? So within the project and the team, we looked at historical law and the nuances of that. and what that means. We also looked at contextual stories that might speak to this story. Another question was about how we understand gender diverse people change and influence by knowing about their criminal actions. So the project allowed me to work with the trans femme writer N.C. Chang, and together we worked on dialogue together. And then we also worked with Nick Aaron, who unfortunately is not with us today, but they introduced us to another story about a trans woman that's currently incarcerated, and the Bent Bars Project. I can put a link about that project in the chat. And I think also understanding the bias of the newspapers at the time and finding fragments of Jenny's voice within those newspapers. Another question was, how could we talk about what would trans people, how can we talk about what we would call trans people living today when we are examining a story of under 100 years ago? And again, working with N.G. Chang and thinking about her experiences and the Bent projects helped with that. And then the final question was, how can we present a transgressive life as a metaphor / a magpie, which is quite a random thing. But we called our salons, our meeting places, the Magpie Salon. And I was very interested in making a representation of Jenny as a magpie, which I worked with the puppeteer Emma Powell to kind of come to make something of that. We've got so little time today that I've just skirted through those initial questions that were on the form. But that was my first response, Tim.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Tom. Maybe what would be great is to tell us a little bit about what you've kind of discovered as a team. So you started out with those questions. And Tom, I think you want to maybe come in there, or Jeannie as well, whichever of you wants to kick off. What's the sense of what you've kind of discovered through the process of undertaking the research? What kind of answers, I guess, do you feel like you've come to some of those questions?
Do you want me to go first, Tom? Yeah, so hello everyone. So I'm a historian and I've worked with Tom on a couple of projects before, and working on this project was really, really interesting, and it's particularly challenging because Jenny was a person who came from a very, very impoverished background in Gateshead at the turn of the 19th, 20th century. And because of that, there's very little recorded about her apart from her criminal records and some newspaper articles. And so, as Tom said, they're what we describe as hostile sources. So we were really trying to read against those sources to kind of get to an idea of truth about who Jenny was, and that kind of idea of authenticity and being true to Jenny, I think, because I think one of the things that we did was to try and draw out her voice, as Tom said, like looking at the quotes that were in the newspaper articles and reports from the kind of criminal trial, and looking at what Jenny had said about the way that sort of she described herself, and she talked about herself, and trying to kind of get her to get her voice to kind of filter to the top and to try and be true to kind of what we could find in the archive and what's available. And that was quite challenging. And yeah, Nick did a lot of the research around criminality and the law at this point, which was really fascinating. And maybe, I don't know if Tom can say a bit more about that as well. But yeah, it was very difficult to kind of trace a history of a person when the sources that you've got are all hostile and all negative, and to try and be true to who Jenny was. And what was really great is that we really did get a sense of Jenny through by kind of reading against those sources. And I think Tom, the kind of, with a lot of Tom's work as well, that the actual process of research is quite performative and then becomes part of the performance, and those kind of challenges are definitely kind of then addressed in the way that Tom performs his shows. So Tom, do you want to kind of come in there?
No, I think that's great. Yeah. Maybe,
Sorry.
I think that's it. Do we want to
Maybe
ask the next question?
Yeah, could I maybe ask Josie actually a question at this point? Because Josie, the stuff that Jeannie's talked about is quite familiar in a sense as a historian, the idea of reading against the grain. And you're a historian, Josie, and I wondered what this being involved in this project has made you reflect about your own discipline of history, or maybe your own research as a historian.
Thanks, Tim. I think as a historian, and we should also say that Sarah Jones was a really important part of this project, but couldn't be here today because she's teaching. I think it really goes back to what Jeannie was just saying about this idea of research as performative and resulting in a performance. And I think we could all tell just from the little snippet of Tom's prologue that we got, that this project is approaching history in a really kind of sensory way, thinking about lighting and sound and scent and costume. And I think when we as academic historians communicate, we're often just using words on a page. And I think that being involved with this project gave a really rich sense of different ways of communicating history, using performance, but also sort of thinking about the kind of visuality of the sources, thinking about metaphors as a tool for understanding them. So we talked a lot about this metaphor of the magpie and Jenny as a magpie and what that might mean. And, that felt like a really productive way of thinking about and drawing out some of the implications of this history. So I think it was that very kind of rich sort of visual, sensory, metaphorical, performative approach that felt like it had a lot to teach us.
Could you tell us any more about that, Josie? Because it's really interesting. I think Tom mentioned up front and about the magpie as a metaphor, and also Tom read back that was in the original proposal as kind of magpie puppet. I don't know what your reflections are on maybe that metaphor or kind of the use of metaphors within academic discourse, because we're often maybe frightened of that as academics. In a lot of what we write, we kind of like avoid the metaphor because it feels like, oh, that's a thing to leave to someone else. And I wondered what your own sense of as a historian of playing with metaphor, how that's helped you, and whether there's other ways in which metaphors now are something that you kind of explore in your own work.
I think you're absolutely right. I think we are scared of metaphors. And I think that's maybe because we often use metaphors in quite a superficial way. So we're just sort of throwing them in. They can come across as a little bit pat or a little bit cheesy. And I think what was different with this process was really using the metaphor as a way of thinking things through, and thinking about interpreting the sources, but also thinking about how those sources could be turned into a story. So we were thinking about the magpie as a metaphor, but Tom and Emma were also talking about developing a puppet magpie that would flap around the stage. So there was something, it sort of went beyond metaphor into something very concrete and tangible. And I think it's just that sort of depth and materiality that perhaps we could be striving after a little bit more.
Maybe I could bring Lois in at this point, because it's really interesting what you talk about there, Josie, that I get a sense from how you've described things so far that in some ways as an academic coming to this project, you've really gained a lot and learnt a lot by thinking about maybe more creative methods, and in particular, some of the approaches within performance. And Lois, I know you're a legal historian, and so you're someone with a really rich knowledge of the kind of legal context. I wonder if you could reflect a bit maybe on how you felt this project has kind of, I don't know, inspired your own research or discipline, but especially what's been the nature or the experience of working in this kind of co-produced method with theatre makers and performance artists. Oh, Lois, I think you're on mute.
Classic error, apologies. So this is not the first performative sort of project I've done, but it's a very, I should say, so affirmed and added to my own sense the values of this kind of work. So I have, so I'd say in terms of the role of creation and imagination, filling in the gaps, the metaphor is a freedom we don't tend to have as academics, but also that sense of filling in the gaps. We're very cautious about when we don't know things and when sources are lacking, how far we can go. And this gives a freedom, which is quite liberating and quite challenging, but gets, I think, academics to kind of think about what the possibilities might be. A good way of responding to history from below were that histories are partial in all sorts of different meanings of partiality. The scraps and sort of remnants and the need to read against again. Different ways of thinking, different things highlighted and sought along the way by different collaborators. It sort of highlights what, you know, our distinct ways of thinking. What we latch onto tended to be different. And sort of added to my own understanding the ways in which performance can enrich understanding, bring history out of the archives. And I think something I'm very keen to do, so I work a lot on cases and history from below, is to try and get emotion and story more into academic work and kind of bridge that gap. And actually, of course, performance does that far more effectively and again, in a more liberatory way.
That's great. Thanks so much, Lois. I feel like, Tom, if you don't mind, it'd be really interesting to get your perspective on this, because you've heard there a couple of academics talking really richly about how working with you and the team, the wider team, the creative team, has really enriched their experience. And I wonder, what are your own reflections about working with them? In what ways do you feel like academic research also enriches the work that you do? And maybe if there's any examples of that from this process.
Sure. Well, I think Nia's going to talk about like how we work together as a group, but without going into too much detail, we did have loads of really interesting conversations, and the conversation that we just had then about metaphor was just really stimulating for me and brought me back to those salons that we had conversations in. But one thing that I really enjoyed was our conversation that we had kind of about truth, and whether there was a sense of that we were obligated to tell the truth exactly as we know it through Jenny's story, or whether there was space to show possibilities. So I have written the kind of bare bones of the show and performed it as a script in hand performance. And the end of the show, I present in a version of a song, like 5 alternative versions of what might have happened to Jenny. And they were informed by contextual information that we talked about as a team, using sources, but also that was kind of inspired from that conversation about truth.
It sounds great, Tom. Is there any, at what point might we be able to get a glimpse of the show? Is there any kind of sense from you about kind of timescales, or when we can experience this for ourselves?
Well, it's still quite in discussion, but it looks like September might be a time in Gloucester, but we're still discussing that at the moment.
Perfect. We'll make sure we let everyone know, and we'll make sure that we get information out to people. Nia, maybe I could turn to you at the end just to say a little bit about the kind of practicalities of working together. Because I think one thing that people are always interested in with the projects that Brigstow funds is, well, how do you do this? Like, how do you kind of work together? And we started to get some hints of that around the kind of salon space as a place of conversation. And maybe your own reflections in particular on doing this during a global pandemic, you know, which presented a kind of particularly challenging set of circumstances, you know, to working together as quite a diverse team across a very different set of knowledges.
Thanks. Yeah, just to give a little intro to who I am. So I'm work with Tom as his producer, so I've been involved in this project sort of throughout, and I'm still assisting him with the sort of development of the show ongoing. So we're aiming to hopefully sort of incorporate a live band, and as Tom said, possibly lead to something in September. But in terms of how we work together, I think in a weird way, I think this project may not have happened were it not for COVID, or at least not at this time. I think as a theatre maker, I think this is true for a lot of theatre makers, Tom would often go through kind of intense bursts of working on something, present it to everyone, and then go straight on to the next project. So this kind of offered, with all the lockdowns, kind of a chance to, I suppose, take a deeper, longer look at something. And I think we were all very keen, as you probably gotten from the Magpie Salon name and everything, that we really wanted to have a sense of fun. We acknowledged that obviously things would be harder in many ways because it was online, and there were some practical issues in terms of getting access to physical archives, but also just keeping up energy for a project that runs across, you know, many months with multiple collaborators from different places. I think that was key. So we had quite a lively feel to our salons. We were sort of meeting, I think, once every 2 to 3 weeks, and we would have these as a kind of couple of hours of Zoom, and they would usually start with Tom doing a sort of mini performance of something he'd worked on from the last meeting, and then we also wanted to have a kind of show and tell element to them. So people would bring in things, they might be directly related to their research. So it might be a new fact about Jenny, it might be something about the clothes that they might have worn, something like that, or it could also be quite tangentially related. But as Lois was saying, it was interesting to start with these different things that everyone would bring to the table, and then you never knew what someone would latch on to and pick up on. So it was really interesting to have that mix of sort of historical research and then the more kind of contextual discussions and discussions on how that can be used creatively. And, you know, as Tom was saying, that meant that we could have quite a different approach to history. So with presenting 5 different versions of what Jenny's life might have been like, you know, that was touching on this long discussion that we had on, do we hold something back if we find out the end of Jenny's story? Do we let everyone know what that was, or is there something to, holding that information back and kind of using a bit more of the contextual research to inform something that's more creatively interesting? So I think it, obviously we would all have loved to kind of have the opportunity to meet together in person for a real life salon, but I think overall the process kind of worked really well online and let us explore the process in a really new way.
Brilliant, thanks so much. Thanks for that, because I think one question people often have is about practicalities. So it's really interesting to hear the way you kind of worked, almost as magpies yourselves, kind of latching onto things that kind of shone at you during those conversations. Maybe we could just ask one question to anyone in the team. Feel free to respond. We'll just have one question that's appeared in the chat, and then we'll ask Mary and Julia to tell us a bit about their project, and then we'll have time at the end for kind of questions across both. It's a question from Francis in the chat, which is to say, well, is metaphors the right word? Is that what was happening here, or is it something more complex, performative language, visual culture, embodied knowledge, or different forms of pedagogy and dialogue? So I don't know if anyone wants to reflect on that, about that sense of what was happening with the magpie's metaphor. Is there more than metaphor going on? I don't know if anyone wants to respond to Francis.
I could just say that, I mean, I think language was something that we discussed a lot, and we talked about the way that we use language and ideas of being authentic, especially, but the ideas of talking about transness and about gender nonconformity and being historically accurate and not being anachronistic in using particular kinds of language as well. But Nick and Tom and I and Sarah all participated in a conference about gender nonconformity in language, which was really, really fascinating. So it was, it's something that made me think about exploring the possibility of transness in my own work as well, further than I had done, and being a bit more talking about it a bit more strongly. But yeah, certainly language and performativity was something that was really important to what we were talking about. I think Tom would agree. I don't know if you want to say anything else about that.
No, that's great.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks so much. We'll be back to you all in a moment with some more questions. But maybe we could turn to Mary and to Julia. And in some ways, I think there's some, it's really nice to have these two projects running side by side in a kind of conversation, because I think there's quite a lot of commonalities, especially around the research process being central to the performance. And Mary, what I maybe could invite you to do, you and Julia, is just to tell us a bit about the project, to kind of maybe start off telling us a little bit about what your research questions were in the focus, and then tell us a little bit about what you've discovered as a team so far, and maybe your own reflections of working together across a number of different disciplines and approaches. So Mary, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. I'll just introduce myself and Julia briefly. So I'm Mary Luckhurst. I'm a theatre historian, especially of process, and I've tended to concentrate on hidden histories anyway, usually hidden histories of labour. But I'm also a practitioner, a theatre writer and director, and Julia is also both, but we've sort of lived our lives in reverse, in that I've been an academic for a long time, but I've always continued the practicing, and Julia's been a practitioner for many years, and then in later years has actually also become a theatre historian and did a PhD. And Julia also runs Pascal Theatre Company based in London. So we've prepared something which I'll just go through. It answers your questions, Tim. And so I think if we just do it and then maybe questions. It's a sort of cumulative story of, I think best summed up at the moment by Samuel Beckett's saying of fail again, fail better. This is a story of collisions, disappearances, implosions and crises, really, as you'll hear, but actually it becomes more and more interesting and pressing to tell this story. So this project began, and its title, although we're still thinking about this, is called Becoming Elizabeth Blackwell. It began as a story about the life of the first female doctor in England to qualify. She was called Elizabeth Blackwell, Bristol-born in 1821, from quite a celebrated local family. She was known to be the first woman with a medical degree in the United States, so she emigrated in order to get her qualification, and also because the family's business failed. She's the first woman on the register of the General Medical Council. And her articles were the first to be published by a female practitioner. She promoted education for women in medicine. She founded the New York Infirmary for Sick Women and Children. And in the American Civil War, she organised nurses, and she lectured throughout her life on the importance of educating women. She was a great friend of Florence Nightingale until they fell out. And actually that's a bit of a feature of Blackwell's life, falling out with especially female friends. A complex figure, she was very bold, but she was also conservative. And paradoxically, she was actually highly critical and often obstructive in relation to reform for women. And to reform for hospitals, even though she was involved in founding two hospitals. She was an abrasive character, and in her writing, she was quite judgmental. And so, you know, Julia and I are both feminists. These were not the kind of, these presented a bit of a headache, to be honest, but this is also what makes her who she is. She mentored women who became very influential, and so an example would be Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who also went on to found the Women's Hospital in London. She took in an Irish orphan called Kitty Barry as a young girl when she was in New York. Her life went between England and America. who was both a companion and a form of domestic help, and really was with Blackwell until her death in 1910. I'll come back to that detail because it is relevant. So that's how it started with those details. I'm going on now to what have we discovered as a team. Well, this project got impacted by the Colston statue and Black Lives Matters in a big way. And it also got impacted by COVID. And so these two things in their own ways have required major rethinks. There have been points where both these factors seem to prevent the project from going ahead at all, and they've halted the project significantly at various points, and we continually review the project developments. And I'd say that these events have actually also impacted the teams themselves, in the sense that, you know, a major partner was Bristol Old Vic Theatre. So the impact on the project content, for example, was that history, I think, really history until I would say actually the last 2 years, has presented Blackwell as coming from, she's been framed as a radical. The Blackwells were framed as radical. They were certainly active in abolition movements in America. But the complication, especially for this project in Bristol, and for sensitivities around Black Lives Matters that we're all still dealing with, Blackwell came from a family who owned a sugar refinery. And so this, and however anti-slavery the Blackwells may have professed themselves to be, there is a paradox at the heart of their story, and you just have to acknowledge that up front. So with the Colston statue events, there was clearly a question mark for Julia and I about, well, should we be telling the story of the first female white doctor to qualify? And how do we do that, given the partner is the Bristol Old Vic Theatre? So we really did have a crisis about that. And that crisis was also reflected in Bristol Old Vic Theatre, who actually said to us, we can't. We're actually undergoing a total crisis about our identity as a theatre, because we've always marketed ourselves as the theatre for Bristol, the theatre for the communities of Bristol. And so they said, we're actually in the middle of rewriting our mission statement. We're re-looking at absolutely everything. We left it that I just said, well, we're reviewing this project, and we've got some leads we're following. And so my question in this was, well, who was the first African American woman to qualify? Why don't we, in medicine, why don't we know her name? And that led on to some quite interesting discoveries, really, which was that both in her life and in her after her death, through historical reception, Elizabeth Blackwell had inadvertently obscured somebody called Rebecca Lee Crumpler's history. And so we then began to think, actually, and I'll tell you a little about Rebecca Lee Crumpler, because I didn't know anything, and actually this is very live at the moment. And, you know, one advantage of the delays is that more and more information is coming into the arena about Rebecca Lee Crumpler. So just to give you some brief details, her birth and death dates are 1831 to 1895, so they did overlap in their lifetimes. She was the first African-American female doctor to qualify at the New England Female Medical College. She was highly influenced by her aunt in Pennsylvania, who was a healer and an unqualified doctor, because she hadn't been able to qualify in her local communities. And so Rebecca Lee Crumpler was highly inspired to go and study. She was accepted into a Boston college, and indeed throughout her course, she was the only African-American female, indeed I think one of the only women on the course. Similar situation to Elizabeth Blackwell, where the male students had actually been asked to vote whether she could attend in Blackwell's case. Rebecca Lee Crumpler published like Elizabeth Blackwell. After the Civil War, Rebecca Lee Crumpler worked in Richmond, Virginia, at what was known as the Freedmen's Bureau. And that was a bureau which tended to about 30,000 African Americans and other ethnicities, and was set up because those people were refused treatment by white physicians. So the parallel in their careers is that although they were both tremendously dedicated to educating women about health and about their bodies, whereas Blackwell, through her background and her social networks, was actually able to found hospitals and to concentrate on hospitals for women and children. Rebecca Lee Crumpler couldn't. Rebecca Lee Crumpler probably wouldn't even have been treated at a hospital. And so their working situations were very, very different. And as a result, the books they write are very different. Rebecca Lee Crumpler's is, I would say, an extraordinarily progressive manual for nurses and for women, talking about common childhood diseases and dispelling common myths about how to look after your baby. Whereas Elizabeth Blackwell is much more about a sort of general health education, and I would say much less hands-on and practical in the way that Rebecca Lee Crumpler was. And I think that was the difference in their working communities as well. So we began to see this connection between the two women, if you like, in the sense that we thought when we initially started writing that there was a sort of invisibility about Blackwell as a female science, and actually we totally revised that, looking at Crumpler, because we thought, right, well, this is an invisibility of a new order. And it's also a sort of interesting material invisibility, and I'll just give you one interesting example of that. I did go and look, for example, at where Elizabeth Blackwell is buried, which is in a place called Kilmoon in Scotland, by a loch which is called Holy Loch, and she has a very large Celtic cross. There's an inscription. It's a very beautiful setting. Significantly, it's also right next to the crypt of the Dukes of Argyll, and so definitely a connection with aristocracy, with a particular kind of English history, actually, even though this is Scotland. That gravestone went up shortly after Elizabeth Blackwell's death. If you compare that with Rebecca Lee Crumpler, Rebecca Lee Crumpler had an unmarked grave until, wait for it, 2020. And so actually there are events that were going on in the 2 years that Julia and I have been involved in this story. And this is why it's very live at the moment, that I would say America, in the aftermath of Black Lives Matter, again, is itself moving swiftly here to try to address a sort of a profound neglect, really. Where we are now, in terms of so this began as a play about Blackwell. What we decided was that we were going to write this story, this script, between the two women in their deaths. So they're both if you like, ghosts, for want of a better word. But we are going to start this story with the fall of the Colston statue, where, of course, even in the present day, looking on this as somebody from Bristol, he would have known about the Colstons and about their heritage. Elizabeth Blackwell, I think, would be stunned to see this and horrified. And where Julia and I imagine that actually Rebecca Lee Crumpler would have a rather different view of this. And so we're writing a series of episodic scenes in which these women exchange, if you like, the particular moments in their lives, and they time travel. So, for example, you know, that there'll be a scene in which Rebecca Lee Crumpler is looking at the gravestone of and very admiring, but also will reveal, well, actually, I didn't have one until 2020, and that gravestone was raised by public donation. A very different set of circumstances, really. We think these two women would have had a lot to say to each other. We think in the present that it would be Elizabeth Blackwell on the steep learning curve, even though she was a reformer, if you like, during her lifetime. And we think that there are really interesting parallels in terms of what they were doing within, and what they were able to do within their social milieus, and even who they were allowed, who Crumpler would have been able to mix with and who not. And so where we are at the moment in terms of the Bristol Old Vic, because the Bristol Old Vic actually for COVID reasons then got hit with staffing problems, even though they love the idea of Rebecca Lee Crumpler and completely came round to that. Actually, last year I started talking to the Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, and I went in to meet the students and look at the work, and to do some talks. And actually, in the discussions with the staff and the students, I discovered that Bristol Old Vic Theatre have had to completely rethink their training. They've had to rethink how they do costuming. They've had to change their whole attitude to hairstyling because they hadn't been tended. They hadn't really, until, you know, the black students began to say, actually, you know, we're fed up with nobody ever being able to do our hair for productions. And we would like, you know, hairdressers who are trained in this. So it's generated and is generating a really exciting new set of conversations around actor training. And so, and I then thought this is the way actually to develop our script, because Bristol Old Vic Theatre School, of course, are closely connected with Bristol Old Vic Theatre, and I thought this is the right place for us to develop our script. And also because I think we'll get quite rightly, some very strong challenges in areas that we need to get the challenges on, or potentially areas that Julia and I, you know, may have overlooked. Just maybe I should let Julia speak soon. On the interdisciplinary research question, I would say theatre is interdisciplinary because of, you know, it can involve any kind of research. But I think what I learned is at the degree of what do you do when there's, it's probably the same question as Tom's, when there's a material absence, you know, that not even a gravestone until now. How do you get back at that history? And so it's surprising what you can uncover, but I suppose we've gone about it in different ways. It's a different kind of investigation, historical investigation, if you like. There's a lot more lateral thinking. Just briefly, the schedule. So we're now working on a script, February and March. We have an open mind about whether that script will be radio or theatre because of the time travel elements. Julia's extremely adept with visual effect, so I'll take my cues from Julia. We also want to do a short documentary, and I mean short, because the process of this and what Julia and I have been through and the kind of crises that we've both had, and that the organisations have had, we think are very much a very important part of that dialogue. And we would then also use that as a calling card with the Welcome and with BBC Radio to see if we could develop this further into a larger project. I'll let Julia pick up on anything I've said there, and just, Julia, do you want to talk about COVID-19 and how you've had to adapt your theatre company and how you see that sort of being of help here in this project now?
Yes, we had a large Heritage Lottery Fund project going on when COVID struck, and we had planned an outdoor event where hundreds of people would be coming to this heritage education project with lots of students and volunteers and the community coming. And then it happened, and we sat down as a company and said, what do we do now? And members of the company were being severely ill. In fact, someone's husband died of COVID. It was a terrible panic. So we sat down, and luckily we had filmed an enormous amount of rehearsal and research processes. So we had a lot of footage, and we had very good filmmakers and web designers. And we said, how can we create a website that reflects and is theatrical and is challenging and is historical and is not just a dead piece of archive, but will invite all sorts of the kind of audiences we had hoped to get in reality. So we spent about 2 months trying to make historical fact and texts into something appealing by asking actors to perform. So the text then became performative, visual, filmed, either on Zoom or when we were allowed to film at distance, we did that as well, with the text written as well, so that one page had many, many different areas, some that could be listened to, some that could be read, some that was performed. So it quite challenged websites at that, I'm talking about 2020 now, July 2020, it quite challenged what most theatre companies were having up on their websites. And it forced us to make this very flexible, very mobile, and to engage with a lot more of our actors and new actors, to bring them in, because we also got some grants in, and we wanted to pay actors and to keep people, I mean, it wasn't a huge amount, but to keep it going to some extent. So we learned an enormous amount about how to transform history into performance, how to make it exciting, how to make it internationally very attractive, because of course, suddenly we had thousands of people. We had, I don't know, about 9,000 people in the first week. Well, we would never have got that in an open performance where we were planning it. So we suddenly saw the advantages. So when Mary came to me with this, and then COVID happened, let's not even go into the Colston statue story yet, we began to engage into thinking about, well, how can we use what we've learned in terms of making history into live performance, make it very present in engaging audiences and bringing in questions and challenges around it with this particular story. So I think we have the team, we have the actors, we have a lot of actors of very different ethnicities to feed into it, and that therefore we can engage with them with the process of transferring the texts that Mary and I developed together and write together into whatever form we choose online. So I think we've become richer culturally and in terms of artistry and skills with the screen. Nothing takes the place of live performance. I feel that very strongly. But I think worst case scenario, we have that. Best case scenario, we have that and we have live performance. So during the lockdown 2020, another project we did about hidden histories, I'm particularly obsessed with hidden women's histories, was we created a team of people who interviewed women living on the margins through community centres, women who had domestic abuse, who were refugees, who were extremely locked down before lockdown. And so this was accentuated, and we accessed them through community centres, and they would go to these community centres. Many of them were not at all digitally adept. So we would have one facilitator would help them. We then interviewed these women, often by phone, really old-fashioned methods, with a writer who would then refine the interview and create a very short text which went on to our project, which was called Giving Voice. We then had 30 women's testimony, women from all over the world. They tended to be older, so we got their experience as children through to older women, so it was very rich. And we realized that this was extremely powerful and the response was enormous. And these are women who would never go to theatre, who would be really separated from the kind of work that we're doing. And it brought them into the company. And I thought, oh, great, we now have members of the company and a new community we would never normally have had. Then in October, I made a collaboration with London Contemporary Dance School and students. And I thought, what would happen if we got those students to create choreographic works using those texts? Most of the students were women, young women, who didn't know how to use their voices because they had a contemporary dance training, but were kind of terrified of owning their voices, using their voices. So part of the process was giving them this material and getting them to voice it. I can tell you that was pretty hard. And it was a very interesting learning process because a lot of these women, for example, there was a Roma woman who talked about racism against Roma. And she said, you know, they call us dirty gypsy. So of course we gave the actors this text to read and they said, we can't say that, they'll think we're racist. So I had to explain to them, no, we are critiquing racism, but we have to reflect back what the woman is hearing. And then they gradually got it. So the learning process was very interesting for the students. 1, giving voice, 2, expressing women's experience, and 3, understanding another kind of racism. Some of them might have had racism from their own heritage, but it was another one. So that was a dance theatre project with people who were coming into the profession, which I found very valuable. And it is another way I think I'm learning there are many ways to disseminate the kind of research and text we're finding into very imaginative ways. And I guess that's what I would like to bring to this project, as well as a piece of text, which might be a discussion between the two women as ghosts in front of the statue. But I think it's just, that's one idea, that from that we could have many ideas and we could really develop this project in many different ways.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Julia and Mary. And I think the projects are kind of brilliant in terms of the way that you've introduced us to Jenny, to Elizabeth, to Rebecca, to these 3 characters, as well as a little bit about the kind of processes of working within what are, I guess, projects where it's hard to work out where the theatre maker ends and the academic begins, that these are much more kind of interesting and productive teams. Please do pop your hand up through reactions if you wanted to ask a question in person, or pop a question into Q&A, or if you have questions, the 2 teams for each other, please feel free to ask a question. Tom's team and Mary's team, if there's kind of questions you'd have for the other team, please feel free to do that. But we'll take a bit of time. We've got a few minutes for Q&A or comment or discussion. And those questions might be more content ones, or they could be more process. It may be that you're more interested in some of the kind of processes that these teams have engaged in.
Can I ask a question, Tim?
Sure.
Because I was wondering with both projects, because they're very, when we talk about projects, we're often looking for kind of thinking about where the next stage will be or where these will progress. And it would just be interesting. I suppose I was thinking more for Jenny, posed as a woman, I suppose there is the performance, but I wondered if there's, because we've heard from Mary and Julia about what the plan is and kind of the performance and academic work so tightly entwined and what will happen from there. But I just wondered if there's a bit from Jenny posed as a woman where there is another life aside from the performance that might be taken forward in some way, and whether the team had thought about that in any way.
Well, there is something that really clearly came to mind was I kind of mentioned about this bent bars project. So at the end of the performance, as it stands at the moment, there's an invitation for the audience to write a letter to a trans person that's currently in prison, having sat through the performance and learned about Jenny's life. So I think that hopefully it sort of stirs something in the audience to want to reach out and and have that experience. Is that something that you were talking about?
Yeah, I suppose it was just thinking about, what struck me and what Nia was talking about was just how you work together as a team. And I suppose it was just whether there was anything, because you talked about Ben Bars, whether there were other aspects of that project that happened, those moments where there might have been other ideas.
A historical moment that's just happened, is that 1920 census has just been released, that finished after we've done the work. But I think that some initial, very tertiary research doesn't find very much, but I think there's more avenues to explore, really. And I think this project is a project that will, it won't have an ending, really.
Yeah, can I just to add to that? I think with other projects that Tom and I have worked on together as well, that they don't necessarily end at a specific point. They're still kind of running along in the background, and you're still kind of looking for things, even if you're not doing that kind of consciously all the time. And another thing that we did that was that came out of the project, and actually it's all down to Nick as well, and it's a shame they're not here to talk about it more, but apart from one of the things that became really clear and really relevant about the project was the importance of discussion of like Jenny's talking about trans lives in the present through Jenny's historical life, and that was really key. And I think again it was Nick that kind of really brought that out, and like talking about bent bars. And we also did do an academic conference as well, like I mentioned before, on gender nonconformity, and again talking about history as being a kind of important part of about talking about historical gender non-conforming lives as a kind of activism in the present as well, and that being really, really important to kind of trace these what Nick described as transcestors, which I think is a really amazing term for kind of talking about people like Jenny. So there was also that, and then that might in itself, we need to catch up about that, but that might in itself have another life potentially as a book chapter if we get that sorted out.
Great, thanks, Jeannie. And I think I'm really struck by that in both of the projects, that there's a very strong sense in which these projects are about the past, but they're also very much about the present. And Mary, that really came across in yours. One question that Steph's put in the chat is a question about historical research methods. And I don't know if Josie, you want to, or Lois, if you want to kick off with this, but anyone's welcome to respond to it. Is what role do you see for introducing performance and drama into research processes, historical research processes? And there was a question there specifically about where verbatim reports of dialogue exist, which you sometimes find within court contacts or court documents, but also in other documents. And I know this is something that one of our colleagues at Bristol, and Will Pooley's really interested in, with some of the work that he's done on witchcraft trials, and working with a playwright there. But I was wondering if anyone wanted to respond to that sense of like how far theatrical dramatic performance might be something that's really has a value within historical research methodologies. Mary, do you want to kick off with that?
Yes, I think it, in a sense, because of my theatre background, I would see any text, including historical texts, as a performance. But I think, just to give you an example, one of the problems that Julia and I have is that in the books that she published, Elizabeth Blackwell was obviously very, very constrained into a certain kind of religious moral discourse that she presumably felt she had to adopt to be accepted. But it does mean that even her books and even her memoir, you're dealing effectively with a persona that she felt was the way, if you like, to present herself. And there are also these other questions. I mentioned the orphan that she took on. Well, the same orphan was with Blackwell until she died, and then taken on by the family, and actually subsequently described Blackwell as her true love and asked to be buried with her. But clearly that was an era in which, if there was any lesbianism, it was totally erased, completely. And true love can mean other things in the Victorian and Edwardian eras, but there is a question mark around that. And there's also a question mark is, I don't yet know whether she got her request granted. And so in fact, was there another obliteration of Kitty Barry, the companion? So I've just found it's a series of obliterations of women, really. And different performances, that they had to role play anyway in order to do what they were doing. And curiously, actually, even though Rebecca Lee Crumpler, there's no doubt she suffered a lot more prejudice, actually, bizarrely, was freer in her writing, I think, because it was such an extraordinary thing for an African-American woman to publish and be published, and for the book to circulate, that there was, in a sense, no persona at that stage that went with it. So there's all these sort of really interesting, sort of rather unexpected moments.
Josie, Lois, anything to add to that? Anything from your perspective of kind of responding to Steph's question?
I was going to sort of say that actually, well, partly this is an ongoing process, so we don't know yet, we're still learning. And I think the way the question's phrased is quite interesting, because I'm puzzled as to what exactly is meant here, and I think that's really good, because I would say at this point that the relationship is fuzzy. It's about process, it's not certain, and that's good. And that, I think, Tom, at one stage, I'm not sure if it's currently in there, you were reading stuff that was actually text in terms of newspaper. We were using text, certainly in some of the performances in the salons, but also that obviously the performance can inform understanding as well, or might be utilised in academic work to work through. I don't know, and that's really important. I don't know.
I got from that question it felt very practically based question, like what's the starting point? And my answer would just be like, just read it, record it, lip sync it, or move to it. It just felt very like, you'd be really surprised how you get this one source and then you immediately start to read it in a more theatrical presentation, and it immediately comes to life. Like, you don't have to do that much work. That's what I got from that question.
I suppose that there's an ethical question, isn't there? That well, there is, I guess, for me, Tom, that which is why it'd be interesting to work with the theatre school in how do we generate Rebecca Crumpler's voice? What would that have sounded like? From Boston, from her community. And for me, that there are certain things that I do feel Julia and I have to be careful about, because that voice and its rhythms, nobody, as far as I know, has tried to generate it.
I guess Jenny had a good voice accent. Sorry, Tom.
I didn't actually say anything there.
Okay,
Someone else.
Because I have a low voice, everyone thinks I'm a man.
Sorry, Julia.
Yes. I'm fascinated by this. I've just written a play where Hannah Arendt figures, and I was kind of terrified of how am I going to write Hannah Arendt, the biggest brain in the world. And it helped me watching an interview with her on YouTube in German, where I suddenly saw how mischievous she was, and what a little devil she was. And it kind of took away the fear of writing this great icon. And not that there's a YouTube of Rebecca Lee Crumpler, as we know, but her text itself gives you a sense of who she is, which is extremely practical, extremely warm. I think I, as a playwright, would look at the newspapers of the period, which were not formal, but gave a sense of the society she was living in. What were the voices which may have oppressed her, but what were they? And therefore, what was her voice? For me, it's very important to find out the cultural and historical landscape that that person lived in, and how much they played a part of that in a masked way in order to survive, and what was the interior voice of that person. And once you've got that interior voice, in a way, it gives you a freedom, I suppose, to go back to the Hannah Arendt discovery. Once you find that interior voice, and I think it's a lot of digging, and it's a lot of listening and a lot of reading. I'm just looking at Mark Twain at the moment, the same kind of period. It's incredibly racy and contemporary. That there is a certain freedom, and it's America, which is not as stuck as England with its Victorian ideas. You've got a multiplicity of voices. That in a way, there is a freedom, but you've got to find that true current, that authenticity, whatever it is. And then, because it's a play and not a documentary, feel free to run with it once you've got that authentic heartbeat.
Great, thank you, Julian. And there's a lot of parallels, I think, there, isn't there, with some of the things that Tom's team talked about with Jenny, with the sense of actually her voice is heard through the criminal record. You know, you don't really hear her voice. So that sense of context and that kind of digging into context, enabling some sense of trying to recapture or to create that voice. And I think it's interesting because I think one thing that's really strikes me about the conversation is that so many parallels between the work of theatre and history. In a sense,
Yes.
we're all interested in past and present. We're interested in archives. We're interested in imagination. We're interested in working with what we have. Sometimes we have the real words. Sometimes we work with a context and create. And I think that's been really lovely about these two projects, is really an exposure not just to these extraordinary stories of these amazing people, of Jenny and Elizabeth and Rebecca, and finally of Kitty as well, but also of the process that underlies so much historical research, so much theatrical research, or so much performance. And thanks so much to both of you, your teams, for sharing with us. It's been great to have an insight into that. And we'll make sure that we keep everyone up to date with when and where productions might take place or readings. So we'll be sure to pass that on to everyone as we get that. I think we're meeting again online very soon. So if you just go to Brigstow events, you'll find details of our next online meeting. So there'll be a chance to see another couple of project teams in conversation, and that'll be coming up very soon. So just if you head to Brigstow web's page, you'll be able to kind of sign up for that. But for now, thanks so much to all of you for this conversation, and bye.